France, of course, from Guatemala, Susan from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Susan for the AHO also. I mean, so many friends connected tonight. Thank you very much. Today, it's the second conference for program, the fall program, Beyond Memory. You might wonder.
Hi, what your family? Can I get a venti black tea lemonade?
Oh, sure.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
You got a sip here.
So we named this program Beyond Memory. So you might wonder why we call it Beyond Memory. You know that we've been doing investigations in Eastern Europe since more than 15 years, and we are collecting the proofs of what happened to the Jews and Roma during the Second World War, what we call the Holocaust by bullets. And we believe, as well as the work that Wendy is doing and many others, fellows researching on the Holocaust, it has to be a work that goes beyond memory. It's not only to keep the memory of those victims, but it's also to collect the proofs of what happened, because it was a crime committed, a man who killed another man. And we need to collect those proofs because we are on a very difficult time where a lot of Holocaust deniers are pronouncing themselves. A lot of anti-Semitism is growing up. So we need to really investigate, bring in the proofs of what happened, village by village, and to tell the people this was a genocide, the Holocaust really happened. So I'm very happy to have you all tonight with us, and I'll give you Father Debois to introduce our host tonight, Wendy Lauer.
Good evening, or good morning, or good night, everybody. And I don't know where you are. I see people from Canada and people from South Africa, so it's not the same timing. And it's a great honor to introduce Wendy Lauer. Wendy Lauer, it's useless for me to go in details. She's a well-known historian and a hard worker historian. She worked on specific subjects, like the book that she published before about the women in the Holocaust as criminals. And I would say what is very special for me, first, she's a friend. It's not only somebody that we found in the yellow page of France. And it's also that she conjugates both an academic high standard level. She conjugates excellent, good relational person, but also she went on the ground. You know, she will publish very soon a book, The Ravine, with a very strong book that she's working on since long time. But you know, it's the first time we have an historian who say, "Oh, I need to write a book. Could I go on the ground, the place?" And I think it's absolutely exceptional, because it's so difficult. Sometimes you have ground people who cannot write anything; they're always on the ground. You have academic people who cannot leave their computer. And it's very special to have Wendy Lauer because she conjugates both skills. And so it's my great honor to introduce her about Holocaust by bullets that she knows, I would say, from the ground and from archives and from the general academic level she's teaching in California now. So welcome, Wendy, and so nice to hear you.
Thank you so much, Father Debois, Marco, and the whole Yahad team. I think I saw Andrei Umansky's also Zooming right now. And I mean, this book would not have, this research could not have been completed without Yahad and Unum not only inspiring me in terms of the work that they do, but actually including me in one of their trips. One of the chapters in the book is I accompanied them in July 2016 to the town that is the place of the photograph that we're going to focus on today. And I wanted to see how they worked in the field and observed them and benefited greatly from that and collected a lot more evidence. And we are both kind of by nature in many ways investigative. That's our approach to this history. And I also wanted to mention that some of the images we're going to see today, because we take that scientific approach, I'm going to be showing some images that are rather disturbing, and just wanted to give you a little warning, forewarning as far as those those images, but this photograph is what started the process, the investigative process. So we need to focus on that today. And the question is, what can be gleaned, what can be discovered from one photograph of depicting the Holocaust by bullets? Each semester when I teach the Holocaust, I ask students, what comes to mind when you hear the word Holocaust? We do a little kind of brainstorming, and they always relate to me images. They kind of have in their own mind a kind of archive of imagery, of iconic images that they've encountered on the internet or in major museums like the Holocaust Museum in DC. Things like the railways leading to the entrance of Birkenau, or the boy at the Warsaw Ghetto with his arms raised, or liberation photos from Dachau, or kind of Nazi images, goose-stepping Nazis, and stills from Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. So most of their kind of recollections or associations with the Holocaust have to do with images, not stories told by or about survivors, and not an historical narrative of the Third Reich. So they, conflate these images with knowing the history. And if I press them a little bit to say, well, tell me more, what's going on in that image that you've described to me, they usually fall silent. So the photo documentation of the Holocaust is vast, and it's accessible on the internet. The USHMM has an archival collection of about 120,000 digitized images, and Yad Vashem has hundreds of photo albums from perpetrators and survivors. And yet the proliferation of these images during and after the war, and their enormous influence in the courtroom as evidence of the crimes, as well as forming our individual and collective memories of the Holocaust. In spite of this, there has been little in-depth research on individual photographs. Much of what we know about, for instance, the boy with his hands raised in the Warsaw Ghetto from the SS album, the Stroop album, which documented the suppression of Jewish resistance, has emerged by chance. So serendipity and online crowdsourcing is part of this process of discovery and piecing together what's in these images. If you look at some photos at the USHMM on their website, you'll find the question, a kind of caption below it that says, recognize someone, so we're encouraged to provide that information because it's hard to come by. So today, the focus of my book, the focus of our presentation today is one photo that was taken in Mariupol, Ukraine, Western Ukraine, west of Kiev, about 100 miles. And it was taken on October 13th, 1941. One can immediately recognize that this is a photo from the Holocaust. The Nazi uniforms, the wartime era clothing of European civilians, the old rifles, the boy with his family being shot by Germans and local collaborators at the edge of a ravine or possibly a pit that's been dug out. In my decades of researching the Holocaust, I had seen thousands of photographs and closely studied hundreds. I looked for images that captured the killers in the act. Too many had gotten away with murder and lied about it under oath. And a single photo like this one was incontrovertible evidence it was a smoking gun. Although the Holocaust is the most well-documented of genocides, the existence of such incriminating photos, one that actually show the act of killing, are rare. There are so few that I can recall them, I can list them. Naked Jewish men and boys being led in the woods in Poland, Palmyra, Poland. Stills from one film clip showing mass shootings of Jews in Liepāja, Latvia. An execution squad in Tiraspol, Moldova. Naked Jewish women and girls being so-called finished off by Ukrainian militia in Misoch, Ukraine. Another one captioned the last living seconds of Jews in Dubno being shot execution style against a brick wall. And perhaps among the most famous, one that was also captioned on the back, the last Jew in Vinica, showing a man kneeling before a pit with a pistol to the back of his head. Most of these have been blown up and put on display in museum exhibitions, creating a false impression that such photos are common. The photograph featured here first came to my attention in August 2009. Since the 1950s, it had been stored in the stacks of the Security Service headquarters in Prague, a KGB-like authority in Soviet-controlled Czechoslovakia. It took the collapse of the Soviet Union to bring it to light. It is the shocking image of mass murder, not as heaps of corpses, but as victims are being killed together, as a family, it seems. None so clearly shows Ukrainian militia shooting alongside Germans in wartime Ukraine, where about 1 million Jews were murdered in broad daylight. These 4 men are clustered together, an armed gang in loose formation. One Ukrainian dressed in a heaven woolen red army coat, and one German in a pressed jacket and jodhpurs have just pulled their triggers. The Ukrainian rifle is inches from the head of the woman, obscured in a cloud of smoke. She is bending forward in her polka-dotted house dress, dark stockings, and leather Mary Jane shoes. She is holding the hand of a barefooted boy falling to his knees, dressed in a little tailored coat and pants. The victims are at the edge of a pit. The woman is dying from the bullet to the head, pulling down the boy alive with her into the grave. According to Nazi procedures, bullets were not to be wasted on the Jewish children. Many suffocate in the blood and soil and the weight of their own kin, crushed under the weight of their own kin. In the foreground of the photo, we see a pair of men's leather booties positioned as if he had just taken them off, perhaps using the tip of the right shoe to pry off the heel of the left one. Next to the shoes is the empty coat lying on its side, like the shell of a man's torso at rest. Empty bullet casings, the litter of mass murder, are scattered on the ground. It must have been mid-morning. Rays of light entered the aperture when this candid was shot, and in the developed print, the contrast was sharp. The boy's dark hair matted on his white face, the shiny leather of the German policeman's visor with silver insignia stamped on the cap. The polka dots pop out in the dark folds of the woman's dress, and the backdrop looks like a canvas curtain with dark vertical lines of tree trunks and blotchy branches. If you look closely, other faces emerge in the photograph. A civilian onlooker in a wool camp stands in the background ready to assist. This is an action shot. There is motion in the moment, in the explosion, in the tense firing postures and grimacing faces of the killers, and the gunfire, the smoke around the woman's head, and the falling boy in her hand. Now, as I put this project together, I started to think, and actually I was participating in a workshop at the museum one summer, and one of the participants, as we kind of poured over the image, had this idea to try to pull out the pieces as separate elements of the photo, and also as kind of investigative leads, what ultimately became chapters in the photo. So the iconic shoes, the environment, the importance of the landscape, and the environmental history, which is also part of the forensic and kind of investigative research when you go back to the scene to try to find clues in the landscape. The pit, was this dug by the local population? Was this part of the process, or were they using the natural terrain, a ravine, to do the work for them, as it were? The German killers and their uniforms, and trying to identify who these killers are. The collaboration of the killers, the Ukrainians, side by side with the Germans. The gunfire, speaking to ballistics experts about trying to piece together whether or not this was a single execution or mass execution. And the formation of the smoke here in this rings indicates that several people were killed at that site before these victims were led to the edge of the pit. The family in the center, the woman with the child. And ultimately, as I studied this more closely, and used various digital technology and zoom lenses and all of that, I started to also make out another victim here, a woman's lap. Evidently, mass murder requires a division of labor, a combined effort that cuts across ethno-cultural lines. The photographer was a Slovakian security guard. He was mobilized for the invasion of the Nazi occupation, invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, and stationed here in Mariupol. His name was Lubimir Scrovena. Like millions of other soldiers, he too got swept up in the camera craze of the 1920s and 30s when he was drafted at the age of 24 years old. The Leica pocket camera had been patented in 1925. The Zeiss Icon hit the market in 1933. By 1939, 10% of German population owned cameras. And during the war, Goebbels embedded 15,000 photojournalists in all the theaters, and they produced about 3.5 million images. Lubimir Scrovena, when he went off to fight in Operation Barbarossa, he also packed his new Zeiss Icon to document the historic events and foreign terrain that he entered into. Corporal Scrovena stands about 20 feet from the executioners. His camera did not have a zoom or telephoto lens, and he stood there with the helpers, possibly the interpreters, the gravediggers, and the confiscators, walking or standing near him without any expression of alarm and not looking at the camera. It seems that the photographer is either permitted to be there, perhaps as part of the cordon of guards, or is openly snapping pictures at eye level or waist level, because the image is very stable, it's very clear and composed. If it were a clandestine image, the photo might be off kilter and unfocused and show an obstruction, like the seam of his coat pocket or part of his hand. And this picture, as as photographers have explained to me, follows a very basic rule of threes in the composition of it. The history of the Holocaust was a German-led European attack against the continent's Jews. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the vast and deep involvement of non-Germans has come into sharper relief and made collaboration an even dirtier word, like the mud and blood stained on the men's uniforms and shoes. The Ukrainians pictured here in Mariupol were not the prominent Quislings or Tizos, treasonous fascist leaders who sided with Hitler. These local policemen committed murder against their neighbors. Scrovena testified about this photograph and explained that the killers, the Ukrainians, actually knew each other, and they also knew the Jews whom they killed in this photo. To publish on such local killers in Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere are silenced, threatened, even criminalized for bringing shame to their nation and for dredging up this dark past of European anti-Semitism, greed, opportunism, and collective violence. Populist leaders like Duda in Poland, Orban in Hungary suppress and distort the history of collusion in the Holocaust, along with the centuries of Jewish life and the corpses of murdered Jews lying just below the surface of their nations. One of the first things that I did after I came across this photograph, it was showed to me when I was in the archives of the museum in DC in August 2009. These journalists from Prague brought the photograph in and wanted to find out more information about it. And they knew, once they asked around and they asked some colleagues like Vadim Altskan and others at the museum who work on Ukraine, and I happened to be at the microfilm reader that day, they said, oh, I think you should talk to Wendy Lauer. I think she might be able to help you on this. So they presented it to me. And then I saw that it was in Mariupol, which was a town I knew from my prior research within the Zhytomyr district in Nazi-occupied Ukraine. And is an important historic, this is a map, actually a rather old map of Jewish life in Ukraine. And already Mariupol is featured, this small kind of shtetl community, and I'm trying to find it down where, oh, there it is, right there, if you can see the cursor. So one of the first things I did was to go to the actual town. This is in the summer. This is before I took the trip with the Ahad. This is summer 2014 was the first opportunity I had to return there and go there. I had been through there before. I just drove right past it. I didn't have a reason to stop on my other prior trips to Ukraine, but now I had this photograph. And this is what Mariupol, the town center, looks like today. This is a monument to the Second World War, and you can see this kind of champagne bottle there, and it's rather desolate. But this was the place where the Jews were gathered before they were marched to the killing site, and a very different community at the turn of the century. Was rather lively, very vibrant economy. This was the marketplace. This is where all the interactions happened weekly among the Ukrainians and the Jews. And so it was quite startling after reading the history to come to this space and just see how it had been kind of gutted, and obviously the absence of the Jewish community there today. And I started to, here's the main square here, and the Jews were marched down from here in this direction towards the forest. So I started to retrace my steps, the steps of the Jews who eventually were led to this site. Now here is a photograph that was part of the photographer's series. When he went to the site that day and he grabbed his camera, and I'll read some of his testimony to you, he had a roll of film with him that could take 8 pictures, and 6 of them are available. So we have, in a way, a visual testimony, a narrative of that day. If the photographer goes and knows I can take 8 photos of this event, and we have 6 of them, and they're taken in a sequence that shows the marching of the Jews, those who had resisted were beaten on the path, those led to the actual killing site, and then the last photos he took were taken from above the actual pit, looking into the pit of the corpses. So it's a form of visual testimony from that day that's provided by Lubimir Scrovena, the Slovakian guard. So when I went eventually and secured these photos, the rest of his photos, it gave me the opportunity to study more closely the uniforms of the Germans. Now, when you find a photo like this series, and here, by the way, you can see this Jewish woman, and if you zoom in, you can see the star, the armband and the star. There's no denying, there's no questioning that this woman is Jewish. So when I found these photos, I was able to focus in on the Germans, and given that this is a crime photo, and that we are living among survivors and witnesses, including perpetrators, my first priority was to try to identify the perpetrators, because they might in fact still be alive and could be held to account. The record on these massacres from the summer and fall of 41 is very sparse, and it's typical for these small communities. This was a community historically of about 4,000 Jews, but because of Russification in the late 19th century and immigration, the turn of the century, and then on the eve of the invasion, there were quite a few who were able to evacuate, including entire families with the Red Army. There were about 1,000 Jews left when the Nazis occupied, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400. It's not clear. And the Germans, when they swept into this community at first, the army, the 6th Army, and then the Einsatzgruppen who came in, a subunit, Einsatzgruppe of 5, swept through there. Only one report, an Einsatzgruppen report, about 24 Jews who were killed because they were quote unquote work shirkers. We have another scrap of evidence from the Ukrainian nationalists, the OUNB, who mentioned in a report that the Jews of Mariupol were killed in early September by drunken militiamen, that there was a pogrom. Another mention by Himmler's command staff, but just very small bits and pieces, but nothing that described in any way, any detail, these massacres from October 41. Secondly, we know from the German record that an order police battalion, 303, was also active in this region, and I searched for years in the trial records of Order Police Battalion 303 to try to put them on the scene in October 41. And this is the same Order Police unit that was participated in the Babi Yar massacres. And in fact, some members of that unit after Babi Yar circled back for these so-called mopping up operations, and they went through Mariupol, not the day of this massacre, but they did go back. And in fact, one of the reports was kind of interesting when they went back for another action, as they called it, at the end of September after Babi Yar. One of the members brought with him a phonograph. They realized at Babi Yar that playing music over the sound of the massacre was something that was that's something they wanted to include in those events. But nothing specifically about October 41. And it wasn't until I kind of got into this cul-de-sac of research on the killers, and I approached a colleague, Andrei Umansky, and I have been working with Alexander Kuglov on this as well, I should mention him. And Umansky said, you go back into the material from the German investigative records at the Bundesarchiv in Ludwigsburg and see if you can find a file there. And I had checked that, but what's classic in this research, what's typical, is that the locations, the geographic locations, of course, are spelled in multiple languages. And the individuals, actually, the archivists and the investigators, misspell, use the wrong diacritics, misplace. And often places in Ukraine are actually misplaced in Russia, right? That was this general assumption and misperception that Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, and so that was all part of quote unquote Russia. So I didn't come across it when I did that database search, and that was another lesson that you know, in this modern digital age of research, that if you push enter and you enter a location or a name and things don't turn up, obviously that does not mean that place does not exist or those events don't exist, and it's very misleading. The absence of evidence does not mean the evidence of absence. And so eventually we figured out by looking at these uniforms, at the markings, as I looked at them more closely, I realized they were not Order Police uniforms. There would have been a white embroidered eagle and wreath on the upper left sleeve. There would have been twice as many shiny buttons on the upper part of the coat above the belt buckle. The cap emblem would have been smaller. The cuffs and collars would have had a black trim. And the large eagle on the hat looked more like an army uniform or another agency. In the file that Andrei Umansky helped me uncover from Ludwigsburg, I found the very slim file, an investigation that was started on the 15th of January, 1969, okay? So the photo is taken in 1941, and in 1969, more than 20 years later, a retired member of what was the Customs Guard unit that was stationed in Mirapol. Basically, his job was to check packages at the local railway station. There was no full kind of Gestapo office or secret police office in Mirapol. It was a small town, but there was a small unit of customs guards at the police station, at the train station. And this retired Customs Guard officer, who lived about 10 miles south of Hanover, in mid-January 69, just showed up at his local police station and said, "I would like to report a crime." And he explained to the police officer on duty, who took this down like any other police report. And it's an amazing police report, because if somebody had come in and said, "Someone stole my bicycle," or "Someone broke into my house," it's the exact same form, 1969. But now this form is a police report talking about a crime scene in Mirapol, Russia, in 1941. And so this man, Hoffman, he was he was denouncing his comrades from the wartime period. He had other motives for denouncing them. I won't go into that. Explains that after he was sent to Russia, he was stationed in Mirapol in the fall of 41. And on one particular night, on a Sunday evening, he and his comrades were hanging out in the canteen, and SS men came in. They were playing this German card game, Scott. And these are important details. They start to kind of build up the veracity kind of the case, that you can, you know, these details are important. So they're playing cards. The SS men appear in the canteen. They say there's going to be a shooting action the next day, and they're looking for volunteers. And two of his comrades, Hoffman's comrades, as he recollected, stood up and said, "Jawohl, I will volunteer." And the names of those two men were Erich Kuska and Hans Voigt. And they are the two men in the photograph. They volunteered. The next morning, Hoffman recalled, we heard bullets, and he starts to describe what's coming from the forest, similar to what we hear from Ukrainian witnesses. We collect testimony from the perimeter of these mass shooting sites. And later, back in the barracks, Hoffman said Kuska and Voigt returned after the shooting, showing off how satisfied they were about the opportunity to participate in the execution, reenacting with their gestures how they doled out shots in the back of the neck of the Jews. Hoffman himself said that he went to the scene and he saw two mass graves that were about 10 meters long on the hill in the direction of the forest, and that the graves were provisionally covered and one could see the limbs of the executed Jews, and he knew that they were Jews. Now, this case shut down rather quickly for insufficient evidence, and at that point, the photo was not available. It was in the archive in Prague. It might have proven, had they uncovered it, had the West German prosecutors made that effort to investigate this more fully, they might have actually seen the faces of the German killers. Instead, the Germans in this unit, in the testimony of that Customs Guard unit, they blame the killing on the Ukrainians, and the perjuring, the kind of lying that they're engaged in these testimonies, when you compare it to the photograph, is really astounding. What about the Ukrainians in the photo? About 10 years after this perfunctory West German case, with no connection to it at all, so you have the images in Prague, the West Germans kind of looking into it in '69, and then fast forwarded to 1985-86, and now the Ukrainians are a Ukrainian prosecutor near Mariupol and for the Zhytomyr district decides that he's going to start an investigation into the crimes in Mariupol. And so this determined KGB investigator started to track down the former militia in Mariupol who killed peaceful Soviet citizens during the war and were traitors to the homeland. The militia pictured in the photo were investigated and brought to trial in '86, '87. A single Jewish survivor from the massacres identified the 3 Ukrainian defendants, and Jewish families from Canada and the US appeared in the district courtroom in Mariupol to speak about their relatives who were lost. And they also participated in the reburial of the remains in the park at the newly erected memorial. The Ukrainian defendants were, one of them is pictured here. Here's kind of the mugshot from the arrest and the fingerprints. Lesko, Nyatuk, and Rubak, these were the 3 men who were convicted. 2 of them were sentenced to death by firing squad and killed in 1986. Killed in 1988. And one of them was a minor at the time of the offense. So he was given 15 years in prison and hard labor, and his fate is unknown. I don't know, after Ukraine achieved its independence in 1991, the file kind of ends with him being sent to Inner Russia, the prison system, but we don't know if he died in prison. It's quite possible. The statements in these files are very valuable. I'd like to talk a little bit, especially because Father Desbois is here and Andre and the team. They're very interesting, the witness statements from the Ukrainians collected by the KGB. But of course, speaking to the KGB as an ordinary Ukrainian in the late 80s, of course, these individuals it was 85, 86, they didn't realize that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. Were obviously very intimidated and nervous about providing a lot of details. They're still living in that community and fear potential retribution or of themselves being arrested. And so when we went back in 2016, the testimony we collected from the local Ukrainians was rather significant. More than about 20 individuals came forward, and we had provided a much fuller picture of the division of labor, hierarchies of labor, how collaboration actually worked on the ground, witnessing, especially young girls who were brought in to dig the pits and cover them, and the dominance of men as the killers. Even here in the photo I showed you, the Germans and Ukrainians, of course, they have nothing in common but this anti-Semitic act. They have no shared language or pre-war history. And the reenactments that occurred during the investigation allowed us to retrace the steps of the Jews, as I did in 2014, and then we did again in 2016. The KGB case allowed us to find these incredible drawings. Here's a map that they produced. Here, that photo I showed you of the marketplace was here, where that champagne bottle was in the monument, and that man was on the bike, and we were walking down this way, and then here is the actual, and so these documents from the KGB case were absolutely critical. And some of my colleagues helped me translate these from the museum when I was there in 2017. You can see Mariupol Park, and here's the actual crime scene, and here's the desert. Here you can see it's in the forest. They have a some trees that are drawn here, and along the river, and the layout of the town is basically an old river town. It was actually a Polish count, had his fortress up here on the hill, and that's the location. So the local Ukrainians, that was their point of reference. So it happened over there in the forest near the fortress, near the old Polish fortress. At the center of the image is what is left of what I believe to be a Jewish family and the community in Mariupol. The victims are clothed and will be buried en masse, a violation of Jewish religious rights. While they are killed, they see and feel the suffering of loved ones, including their own children. And this really, the mother and child, which is also very kind of an iconic Western, aesthetic, well, actually it's global image of the mother and child. I just started to think more and more about that image in the center of the photo and how powerful that was, and also how Nazi perpetrators, as the escalation in the Holocaust began to include full families and communities and women and children, this was a monumental shift. And it was something that I realized that this family, the destruction of the family, as a kind of root and branch destruction of a community, that was the core element of a community. And that maybe this theme of the family was something that we should look at more closely, not only as victims experience the horrors, but also in the mindset of the perpetrators in their extreme intent of destruction, biological destruction, to tear apart those generations and destroy those families. In fact, in the summer of 1941, as I started to dig down into this theme of the family and genocide history, Hitler himself had said to one of his Croatian ally, Kvaternik, one of his prophecies, and which was one of his revealing his intent, his goal. He said not one single Jewish family should be left alive on the continent of Europe. And he was very specific about the fact that if any family members survive, they will rise up and they will avenge their lost relatives. And that was like one of the biggest threats in terms of resistance. The dominant scholarly approach and popular way of counting for the Jewish victims and memorializing them is through scale, 6 million, and individual lives. While entering the exhibit of the USHMM, visitors are given an identity card with the biographical details of one victim. Individual names are read aloud on Yom HaShoah. By contrast, national commemorations treat the victims as much larger entities in population figures such as Poland's 3 million or the more than 33,000 who died in Babi Yar. But what about the loss of the family? The family, the most intimate social unit that held communities together. Was not the murder of the entire family another dimension of the horror and loss and intent that defines genocide? I started to look into these Soviet records. These are lists of Jewish victims. Mariupol was reoccupied by the Red Army in January 1944, and the Soviet Extraordinary Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes began to collect testimony about the mass shootings. And here is a page from their final report dated May 45 that showed 960 civilians were shot in Mariupol during 2 mass shootings, one on October 13th, 1941, so that's corroborating our photo, and one on the 16th of February, 1942. You can see on these lists, again, I get used to kind of looking at the names, but starting to see the family units, right, which is so important. We research the Holocaust through genealogy and Jewish Gen and other survivor databases. It starts with locations, it starts with family names, but as you look at these victim lists, you can see the different birth dates and start to look at some of the kind of configurations of mother, parent, sister, and so forth. So how do we find family, that the victims? That was the biggest challenge in all of this. They were, how do you take that photo and then overlay it with a list like this, which is an incomplete list? So I ended up with 452 names for a community. The estimate of those murdered there went from like 900 to 1,000. So I only had half of the names from that community to begin with. And the individuals in my photo, of course, could be what I call among the missing. What about, we have to acknowledge that we just don't have all of the names. And we know from the Names Project at Yad Vashem, their central database of Shoah victims' names, that about 50% of the Jews who were mostly gunned down in the ravines, marshes, forests, and open fields of Ukraine have not been identified. So every fourth murder victim of the Holocaust lived in what is Ukraine, today's borders. But about 50% of those still have not been identified by name. However, incomplete, it was all I had to work with. So I went back, I ended up traveling to Yad Vashem and working through this list and going through their digital database, their pages of testimony that are filled out by surviving family members on behalf of their murdered relatives. And I ended up focusing on, since that boy in the photo, we go back to the photo, you know, you can see, whoops, it's hard to estimate the age of this woman, obviously, but you know, one can kind of guess that this might be a boy born between 35 and 39. And so as I went through the list, I started to pull out, you know, where there was a boy, you know, where I could find what was a family configuration. And I focused on those and began to sketch genealogical charts to see the relationships and the generations of loss. I could see how the genocide is the destruction of an entire community, family by family, root and branch. And creating those family trees was an interesting act of memorialization in the form of research. This is the pages of testimony from one of them that I was going through from Mirapol, to give you an example of that. As I was searching alphabetically through all these pages of testimonies, A through Z, for anything from Mirapol and the surrounding towns, I got to V and the name Vaselyuk. And the page stated that the family, mostly women, but with small children, had been killed in the park in Mirapol in the fall of 1941. And I turned the page, and attached to it was a photo that just jumped out at me, this photo. I called the archivist Rita, and we were stunned as we looked at the faces and read the information. Less than 1% of the millions of pages of testimony actually contain photos, and not photos from 1941. This photo that was attached to the page of testimony was taken in 1941. Roman, you can see Vaselyuk. This photo was taken shortly before they were murdered. It was taken so that we would remember them. It is what is left of that family, the grandmother, the aunts, the children. At the bottom of the form was the name of the submitter, a descendant. Here, Southfield, Michigan, Svetlana Budnitskaya, born 1936. She was 5 years old in 1941. I saw her address there, and I saw a phone number. I got a phone number. It was about 10 a.m. Central Standard Time in the US, and I called the number, and I was shocked when an elderly woman with a Russian accent answered the phone. Hello, yes, I am Svetlana Budnitskaya. I explained, my name is Wendy Lauer. I'm a professor of history and a scholar of the Holocaust in Ukraine. I'm calling you from Jerusalem. I'm doing research at Yad Vashem. And I found a page of testimony that you submitted, and the photo that shows that little boy, this little guy, Roman. Yes, please tell me about that boy. And then she explained, yes, they shot him, the fascists, with his mother. And the girl, do you know her name? This one. Thinking this might be the girl on the lap of the woman in the photo. Svetlana became confused, and she started to yell and wail and cry. Send me a letter, I will tell you. I know, I will give you more photos, she said. I have more photos, those fascists, how they schieß. And she started to get out of breath. And what they did to my grandmother, she said, Esya, she was paralyzed in bed. They carried her in her bed. wrapped in white sheets, and they threw her in the pit. A pit, I said. Oh, Svetlana said, it was like a ravine. It was near the river, in the park, in a big hole. Roman, that was my cousin. These were my cousins. Those children were my cousins. All of this seemed against the odds. The improbability that a photo was taken by a Slovakian guard, that it was locked for decades in the Prague archives when it could have been used by investigators, that it made its way to me in DC while I happened to be in the archives that day, the incomplete list of victims, the luck of finding another photo of a family posing as they wish to be remembered, who were also victims of that massacre, whose story so closely resembled my photo of the massacre. The odds of connecting with an elderly survivor in Michigan who picked up the phone and started to corroborate the story I had in the photo in my hotel room, but she had never seen. It all just seemed impossible. I wanted to believe it all, but knew that it had to be certain. I could not misidentify anyone in the photo. I went back and showed the photo with the Yahad team in July 2016. That was one of the images that we presented to try to perhaps trigger memories among the witnesses. And a few of them, at one point, one of them said, oh, I think I recognize this one woman. I think I saw her in the marketplace, pre-war, kind of strolling in the marketplace. But ultimately, we could not get anyone in Ukraine in 2016 to make a kind of positive identification of those individuals in that photograph, nor could anyone in 2016 make any kind of identification from the mass shooting images that we also brought with us. In fact, those images, usually the reaction to those was to turn away because the murder is difficult to look at those photos. And here we are with the team. This gentleman was a peasant near the mass shooting, his farm was near the forest and was out grazing. And you know these stories from Father Desbois, and he's pointing out, recognizing some of the uniforms from the German officials and describing what happened that day. And here's another Ukrainian witness who actually, she had occupied a house. It was a so-called Jewish house in the town square. That image I showed you before of the desolate town square. Her father was employed by the Germans, and so part of the compensation was a Jewish house, and they were there. And she, as a girl, peered out the window and saw the rounding up of the Jews the night before the killing that took place in the photograph we're looking at today. Now, what about the photographer? I want to wrap up with a photographer. As I went into this, I must say, you know, it's such a grim photo, such a shocking and disturbing image. And I went into it investigatively, you know, trying to find out the who, what, where, when. And I was really quite astounded and surprised and reassured in a way, and became more hopeful as I uncovered the story of our photographer, Lubimir Scrovena. And there he is in the post-war period, I think in the 50s. And there is his photo of his actual camera. This is the camera that he used to take that photo that we're looking at. And my colleagues at the museum, I gave them a lot of the information about this story, and they, of course, became aware of the photo, and the museum featured this photo from Mirapol in their very important exhibit on complicity, Some Were Neighbors. And when that image from Mirapol was on display at the museum, I used to go down and just to the actual exhibition, temporary exhibition, and just watch people looking at the photo, and I was looking at them, observing their reactions to the photo. And sometimes I would talk to some of the museum visitors and ask them, you know, what do you think of this and so forth. So it was also kind of an interesting part of my research. But in any event, I gave the files to my colleagues who were doing work in Europe trying to find artifacts for the exhibit, new artifacts. And they actually tracked down the camera. So that's quite something, because the camera, as I mentioned before, once I knew what the camera was, I had in my hand, I could figure out what was possible as far as the technology of the camera, and how many images could be taken that day. And that was also part of the story. So already in 1943, Scrovena, he ends up taking this picture, and I'm going to read testimony from him in 1941. And he's back in Bratislava. He's done his tour on the front. He's back in Bratislava in 43. And he gets a summons from the secret police headquarters in Bratislava, their version kind of the Gestapo. And he's called in to testify about what he was doing on the Eastern Front, because one of his former comrades suspected that they knew he had taken pictures, and they suspected that he was using these pictures in acts of to subvert the collaborationist regime, right? He was part of the resistance. He was making photos that were not permitted and working against the new order in Europe, is what it said. So we have a paper trail on Scrovena from the secret police records of 43. And we have him, this is the first time he's questioned. He was born in 1916. We learned that he owned a radio shop in Banska Bystrica, which was the center of Slovakian resistance, if you know that wartime history. And that he'd returned from the Eastern Front, had been part of a security division. And he had other things that he had brought back from the Eastern Front that were deemed suspicious by the Slovakians. He explained when he was interrogated in 43 that he took part in the campaign, and he had the opportunity to see the atrocity of the war when Ukrainian militia and German, and he called them, and this is 1943, German finance guards. This was a really important detail. As I mentioned before, I was trying to figure out for years who those Germans were. Were they SS? Were they ordinary police? Were they military? And here, because Scrovena was there, and it was just this detail that nobody else maybe would have, grasped was important, but he says finance guards. And then it corroborated those files from 69 of those customs guards, that they were this kind of particular unit. And Scrovena talks about the partisans who were shot. He doesn't refer to them as Jewish victims. And he says they were shot because they resisted, and so he took pictures of it. He claimed that he came back home with these photos and didn't show them to anybody. He said that he burned them, wouldn't to end up in the wrong hands. He said that the pictures were taken with the approval of the German commanders. So these were very important details from 1943. What we find out later after the war, he survives that interrogation. They let him go. The Lubimir settles down after the war. He has 2 children. He's married. And then suddenly in the late 50s now, the Czechoslovak government now is going after Slovak collaborators, because it's a Soviet system. And they go back to Scrovena and they say, we heard you were on the Eastern Front. We heard you took pictures, and they bring him back in to be interrogated. And at this moment, though, he's forced to bring in his photos. And that's the file from 1958 in which these original photos where they reside. And those are the photos that were brought to me to the museum in 2009 that those Prague journalists had uncovered. It was this file from 1958. And it's 5 photos that they had confiscated and 66 negatives. And he was detained for 48 hours and he questioned about what happened. And he tells the prosecutor, and I'll just quote now so you can hear the voice of our photographer. One Sunday morning, he said, probably in October 41, I was woken up by soldiers from the company saying that the German soldiers were detaining citizens of Jewish faith. Now he describes them as Jews. And that they could hear shootings close to the town of Mirapol. Then later we learned that the Germans were shooting civilians. Based on this information, I was sent with 2 other Slovak soldiers by our company commander to find out what was happening. I took my camera with me. We went to the hill in the forest at the edge of town near the citadel where the civilians were being held. And then what I saw, the Germans were bringing those people in groups toward a clearing in the woods where there was a pit that had been dug out And there were already corpses of murdered citizens already laying in that pit. When they brought around 10 people to the pit, they ordered them to undress, which most of them we see in the images are dressed, so that's interesting. And they shot them in the back of the head, and I took pictures. All the persons in the photos, which I submitted to you, were murdered, and I personally saw it. I would also like to point out that the prints were made to capture the entire crime scene. As far as I know, the members of the militia were citizens of Miropol. These militiamen knew very well the local conditions of the area, as well as the Jewish citizens who were arrested and murdered. Scrovena also stated that he took the photo to remember his wartime experience as a souvenir of the war. By establishing that his prints showed the entirety of the scene, Scrovena was also trying to avoid his examiners questioning whether there were other Slovakian guards. Remember, they're trying to hunt down the collaborators, the Slovakian guards, and also stressing that he was an onlooker, he was a witness and not an accomplice. Now, the questioning concluded and Scrovena went home, but the investigation continued, and they actually followed him home and burst into his house. They confiscated more things from his household, and when I interviewed Scrovena's son, Lubimir Jr., he has vivid memories of that encounter with the KGB and how terrifying it was. The investigation by the Slovakians was dropped in 1 year later, and it was dropped because the KGB could not, as they stated in the file, we could not identify persons in the photographs. Just as the case was propelled by visual evidence, the inability to identify and actually deeply research the photographs halted it. Now, the photographer, Lubimir Scrovena, was up to a lot more than taking photos. Scrovena was trying to testify to us with his images in a way that James Curtis, a specialist of early American photography, stated, if we determine the meaning of a documentary photograph, we must begin by establishing the historical context for both the image and its creator. A documentary photographer, and today we have this field of what we call human rights photography. In fact, I was just talking to one of them the other day. I was interviewing Eli Reed. But a human rights photographer is an historical actor bent upon communicating a message to an audience. Documentary photographs are more than expressions of artistic skill. They are conscious acts that reveals a fervent desire to let images tell a story. Documentarians from Matthew Brady to Dorothea Lange succeeded because they understood the desires of their audience and did not shy from molding their images accordingly. Far from being passive observers of the contemporary scene, documentary photographers were active agents searching for the most effective way to communicate their views. Lubimir Scrovena died in October 2005. Before he passed, I'm concluding now, he did two things related to the photos. In 1994, in post-Soviet Slovakia, he wrote a letter to the Minister of Interior. He requested the return of his photos. They were in the Prague archive. Remember, they'd been confiscated by the KGB. He wanted those photos and he wanted the negatives back. He also did something else which was rather surprising. He donated the camera that you see, which he used and is now in the Museum of History of Jews in Bratislava. For this 25-year-old at the time of the war, why did he do this? This was this period, this moment, I would argue, this witnessing of this massacre was a liminal moment. It was a turning point for him. It was his enough moment. There was nothing that he could do, or so it seemed, to save those victims at that scene in October 41. The action was underway when he found himself, as he said, at that place. Perhaps being there was this pivotal experience because it shaped subsequent choices and risks that he undertook himself and to his family. He refused to stay on the front after that massacre. We have his letters. When I met his family, they shared the letters that he wrote back to his wife. He feigned illness. He spent months in a nerve clinic and then resumed contacts with Jews in Bratislava and Banska Bystrica. And he hid some in his home, in his attic of his family home. One of the Jews family of Jews he hid in his attic was the obstetrician who actually brought his son, Lubimir Jr., into the world in autumn 1942. He helped this doctor secure a hiding place in the forest with his comrades in the Slovak national resistance. But Scrovena could not save him. The doctor was in the forest with his wife and child when the Germans and Plinka guards discovered them and shot them in November 1944. Scrovena was anti-fascist and anti-Soviet. He felt no pride wearing any government-issued uniform, and he hated the war. As Arendt described images of the Holocaust, they are, quote, an instant of truth. What truth was Scrovena affirming in such a horrific image of suffering? What I discovered was that this atrocity image, which seemed to be taken by a collaborator, was taken by someone who was a transformed witness, who took the photo as a warning against such horrors. The image became his statement against the war and against the mass murder of innocent women and children. Photographs, if we choose to study them, are not merely illustrations of an event, nor do they bring closure to a traumatic event. They open up new questions and lead one down paths of discovery to new stories about what happened. Some post-war theorists of atrocity photography would urge us to not even look, let alone scrutinizing the suffering of others. Cultural critic Susan Sontag argued the shock of such photographs might desensitize, that we'd somehow become inured to the violence. I disagree. Only now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is it possible for us to connect an image like this one to the thousands of pages of investigative material and to witnesses who had the view we see here. This is the protocol. Sorry. Who dug the pits, the policemen who drove the family to the edge of the pit, the perpetrators who pulled the triggers, the laborers who covered the mass grave, and forensic investigators who exhumed it in 1986, and the photographer who was haunted by this image until he died in 2005. The extensive but dispersed written record of what happened in Mariupol on that day in October can now be seen 70 years later in the photograph. Over time, the physical traces of the mass graves and former ghettos will be harder to detect and identify. But the millions of Jews who were massacred in broad daylight in places such as Mariupol, Ukraine, did not disappear as the perpetrators wished. And in fact, many perpetrators and collaborators photographed them in their final moments. A single photo can recover what was assumed to be destroyed without a trace. It can illuminate the methodological possibilities and pitfalls of 21st century database research. Holding the photo, I realized the power of such image as it passes across time and space from its creator to family members, prosecutors, curators, historians, and a viewing public. It has the power to put things in motion and to elicit from those who study such an image or questioned about it an avalanche of emotions and information that advances our understanding and knowledge of the Holocaust. I wanted to show you some images from the field work, if you want to call it that, on the groundwork, including the trip that I made with Yahad in 2016. I already showed you some of the images of the interviewing that we did with those Ukrainian witnesses. This was the prison, the guard police station, and you can see here in the testimony that we collected from Germans and Ukrainians, they described Jews who were kept in the basement here in this prison, and here you can see that. So this on-the-ground work is so important for corroborating these statements in the most concrete way. This is the path to the forest, and I went through this. Here's the team. There's Andrei Amansky right there. And we used that KGB map that I showed you before to actually find this location. I didn't find it in 2014. I found it with the team in 2016. You can see they have a photographer as well. And we're just going in here for the very first time. And looking around. And discovering the landscape and the various, the haloing effect, the kind of disruption to the surface, the topographical disruption, the compression of the land, and the kind of, it has a kind of moonscape to it. Of course, it's overgrown here, but as we stood there, we realized that this erosion was not natural. And in fact, we were standing there kind of quietly and somberly, and we did find bones, and that was quite shocking. We started to just look down and move the muck around, and this is, I think, a piece of a vertebrae. We also found remnants of skulls. And the reason for this is because when the KGB carried out its investigation and trial, Soviets in 1986-87, they went back to the mass grave site and they carried out an exhumation. And they used this kind of equipment, and they overturned up all the bones and the soil, and again disrupted the souls, disrupted the victims who were buried there, and that is why those bones were so close to the surface in 2016. When I came back from this trip in 2016, and we discovered those bones, I did contact the German memorial for the victims, the Ermordung Memorial in Berlin, the National Memorial. And they had a program at that point that was funded to go to these sites and to mark them. And I gave them the coordinates, and they went out. In fact, I had only been back in the US for about a week. I was shocked. I was here in New Hampshire, and I got a phone call from a representative of the memorial, and they were at the scene, and the person was standing there and describing where we had been a few weeks before, and just informed me that they would not be able to undertake this as a memorial project. It was too complicated to cordon off that area and preserve it and do the memorial work, because it is historically part of this military base. First the fortress, the Polish fortress, then it was a Soviet military. Indians have some mostly civilians residing there, but it's difficult to negotiate that erection of a memorial there because of that, the land. The end of my book kind of try to exhale in some way after the intensity of the imagery and of the research and the findings, kind of landing on this issue of the shoes in the image and the iconography of shoes in Holocaust education and memorialization. Here are shoes along the Danube in Budapest, and here are those encased, enshrined in Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and a plea for not enshrining, in a way, not putting these things, of course, to conserve them and preserve them behind glass, but metaphorically to not enshrine those shoes, but to argue for this kind of investigative work and the search for the missing. This is an image of from Bella Liebman of the Szeged, Hungary. Some 4,000 Jews deported from this community, mostly killed in Birkenau, also sent to a slave labor camp called Strasshof. And here are these women trying to find, and the way I was trying to find the victims in my photograph, and they're looking at the individual imprint of the shoes that were left from those who had been deported, and that the search continues to this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And we have with us Andrzej Umański. So, Andrzej, would you be so kind to give some words to end up this conference, please?
Sure. So, hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Wendy.
Hi, Andrzej. It's wonderful to see you.
Yeah, thank you. Brought back some memories from 4 years ago. So thank you so much for this almost like a criminal investigation about all the perspectives, the perpetrators, the victims, the photographer, the neighbors. So it was a very extensive micro study of what happened on the ground. And I remind how we worked on the ground. It was a real study like we do with Yahat, and having you by our side was very exciting and interesting. So I am eager to read the book.
Wendy, I would dare a question. I never imagined the amount of research you did. I would dare a personal question. What did it change for you to make such a research?
I think that you referred to this at the beginning in the introduction, and the importance of every, the incremental gains that Roll Hilberg talks about with every trace. And now he, of course, wrote his multi-volume study primarily based on German documents, and his Sources of the Holocaust book kind of then revisited the issue of sources and looked at them more kind of holistically and in their varied forms. But again, to just stress the interdisciplinary nature of what we do as an investigative, collaborative undertaking. I mean, at every step along the way, I had to draw upon colleagues, whether it was language barriers, my not being fluent in Slovakian, obviously, because we're studying the landscape, the topography, and looking at Carolyn Sturdy-Coles's work on forensic Holocaust kind of forensic archaeology work, on witness testimony collection with Yahat, going to those sites, walking around and looking at proximities, also understanding the importance of that testimony from those Ukrainian witnesses, especially the women, now women, but often girls at the time, and understanding the gendered dynamic of all of this and that gendered hierarchy in the massacres. Even through your work, Father Dubois, of coming out of a kind of being a student of Hilberg and his famous metaphor of the machinery of destruction for the killing centers, thinking of the Holocaust by bullets is also a kind of machinery of destruction, how nature is put to use, how there is a process. It's not Keystone cops show up, it's very, as you have your book in broad daylight, the measuring of this, the securing of the material, how does that actually happen? And once you look at it that micro level, your understanding of participation expands into this whole social history of a community, and that stays in that place and resonates in that place, and it's part of that history. Whether the local population wants to talk about it or not, but it is very much there, even in the absence, even in that scene of that desolate marketplace, to question, those changes. And so it just, I had gone into the Soviet Union in '92, so I kind of got into this, going to the sites and doing the field work early on. But more to see, but not to understand how much going to those spaces and those places corroborates, what we're trying to do in reconstructing the crime, and also to appreciate what it means for those local communities and what, local Ukrainians having witnessed these traumatic events or having participated in them directly, those reverberations as well. So that, these are some of the things that that came into sharper relief for me. And in the process, those themes that I talked about, the importance of visual testimony. We talk a lot about verbal testimony, but what are we seeing when we see photographs, especially a series of photographs or a photo album as another form of testimony? And to keep studying those images. There are things in that photograph that Scrovena didn't see when he clicked it, or maybe he cropped it out, or, but because of our expanding knowledge of the Holocaust, we find other things. Like I saw that, just recently I zoomed in on that picture of the woman with the white dress and saw the Jewish star, and that's obviously very important because we know from the Wehrmacht exhibit that the Germans unveiled in the around 2000, you know, that you have to get it absolutely right. I mean, as far as who are the victims in these images, the Soviets used some of these atrocity photographs for other reasons, and some of them are you know, have been cropped or airbrushed or manipulated too. To be wary of that. So, and then lastly, the resistance piece, that this figure, Scrovena, was so, you know, inspired by him. I see, you know, the very dark history that there's this person who was indeed changed by this witnessing, and did what he could as one individual could do under those overwhelming circumstances.
Thank you. Papa.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have my microphone on. Just wanted to thank you, Wendy, very much for your conference. It shows also how important it is to collect the proofs of the genocide, the proofs of the Holocaust, and doing real work of research and fight Holocaust deniers and anti-Semitism today. So thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who participated tonight. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks for the next conference. Thank you very much, Wendy.
You're welcome. Thank you for your forbearance. I know I went on for a long time. I just finished the book, so I've got, you know, a lot to share. I hope I didn't. It wasn't too much of a burden. I was just talking too much.
It was great.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Everyone, be well. Be well. Be well.
Thank you. Bless you.
Yeah.